Sure, I got hit point blank, but luckily it was only a shotgun. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. A few years ago, friends from Hong Kong and Taiwan would ask me, hey, when you started shooting in the mainland, did you ever run across the infamous Black Star pistol? And I said, no, what's that? And they said, oh, it's a ubiquitous and fearsome gun all across Eastern Asia, beloved of gangsters for its terrible power, and it comes from the Chinese mainland. I was dumbstruck. I thought I had shot every handgun in the Chinese arsenal. I looked into this and found little information at first until I realized, oh, I had one in my safe. What they were calling the Black Star pistol was China's Type 54 Tokarev. And of course, if I had been a little quicker on the ball, I would have realized, oh, right, Black Star pistol. It's a pistol with a black star on the grip panels. Well, I wondered how it had acquired such a mystique and this terrible reputation. And I came to learn that, sure enough, it was the favored pistol among the gangsters of East and Southeast Asia, partly because it was cheap and available. By that point, the Chinese mainland had manufactured at least 2.5 million of these things. And even though it's not easy to come by guns in the Chinese mainland, I'm sure if you have enough money in hard currency, there are people who will set you up. And I think this started in the days when the mainland was sealed off from Hong Kong and Taiwan, and it really was a sort of semi-inaccessible place of mystery, so that things that came from the mainland were extra mysterious. And the people there had been through a lot, and they were definitely tough. So a big black gun that had been smuggled through illegal channels from this semi-hermit kingdom that was the Chinese interior then must have seemed extra forbidding and malicious. But also, we saw in our last episode that the Type 54 was considered really not great for police work, but pretty decent for assaulting things. And it turned out that the criminal underworld found that it was actually really great for assaulting police. This is how that happened. Around the 1980s, it wasn't just the United States where law enforcement began finding that the criminal underworld had up-armed itself. And suddenly, police officers using the old, reliable 4-inch, 6-shot, 38 special police revolvers were now behind the curve against criminals who had access to military-grade weapons. If you're in the United States, you might be thinking of the infamous FBI gunfight. I think that was 1986, or later, the North Hollywood shootout. Well, this kind of thing played out in Hong Kong, too. And in Hong Kong, these incidents starred none other than our old friend, the Type 54 pistol, under its local guise as the awe-inspiring Black Star pistol. This began with a man named Wu Jiandong. Wu Jiandong was from the province of Guangdong or Canton in the Chinese mainland, and he had come across, smuggled himself into Hong Kong illegally, and he became a very low-level enforcer for the Hong Kong underworld. He was not a serious player in the crowded hierarchy of Hong Kong's gangland. He wasn't connected, he did not have a bright future there, but he got work as a strong-arm debt collector because he had a reputation for being unusually violent and thuggish. He had grown up in the mainland in the years of the Cultural Revolution, and life had made him tough. Wu Jiandong's signature was that he carried around a Type 54 pistol, and he would brandish it at people. In those days, the Hong Kong gangland, of course, it wasn't a gentle place, but maybe in historical perspective, you could say it was pretty tame. It certainly wasn't all gunned up. The Hong Kong underworld had a lot of what you could call social violence, dominance displays, like primate behavior, like sticking your chest out with imaginary lat syndrome, and a lot of pointing and yelling and cursing. 你少他妈炸翅，气你丫板砖战将。
Don't you damn well bristle your wings at me, i.e. in the manner of an angry cricket. You illegitimate son of a serving girl. I ought to slap you upside the head with a brick and use your brains as a condiment for snacks.
Maybe some fists would fly. In a really crazy case, somebody might pull out a vegetable cleaver and start slashing the air with it, and then somebody would pull him back. Largely symbolic violence, not truly predatory violence. But Wu is different. He would carry around this Type 54 that he had smuggled in with him from the mainland. And if somebody got in his face, he would whip that thing out straight away, just escalating from like 1 to 11 all of a sudden. And in that time and place, to even have a gun, much less whip it out, was considered a shocking escalation, even in gangland. Also, Wu put out the word that he had military training, and legend had it that he'd fought in Vietnam. And he leaned into that. If like young guys would come and talk to him, he would brag about the action that he'd seen south of the border in Vietnam. But it was actually a lie. I mean, Wu was tough. He had grown up in the Cultural Revolution, a time of real anarchy, as just a feral kid when children weren't in school because the school system was not functioning. Teenagers grew up with no authority, and the whole country was really untamed and practically ungoverned for a good 10 years. So Wu had grown up as part of what in any other context you would call a street gang. And it seems that he was involved in violence where people ended up dead. He had definitely seen and done rough stuff. But he wasn't an ex-soldier. At most, he had worn a uniform because all the Red Guard kids did then when they were like playing child soldier on each other and on harmless grown-ups who got in their way. And probably he'd handled some weapons before, but not a real veteran, not a combat soldier. However, just with that background alone, when he got to Hong Kong and he sized up even their criminals there, he was just like, these people are kittens. They don't know real violence. So Wu saw a chance to get ahead. Basically, he was a person who was willing to escalate faster than other people to real, serious, no-bull violence. And he arbitraged that skill by becoming an armed robber. In 1981, Wu Jiandong gathered this group of four other underworld lowlifes, I think all from the mainland, like him, like sort of extra desperate illegal people who were looking to make a pile of hard currency fast and then escape back into the relative protection of obscurity in the mainland. So they went over and they hit a jewelry store in Hong Kong. And a pair of Hong Kong police responded quickly, each of them with a nice 38 special revolver. At this point in Hong Kong police history, they probably would have been Smith & Wesson Model 10-7s. So the Hong Kong police show up, and in their frame of reference, in the relatively tame world of Hong Kong policing, as far as they're concerned, like they've shown up, they have guns, they win automatically. So their attitude is, okay, here we are, bad guys, with guns drawn. We will now accept your surrender. What they did not expect was resistance, much less armed resistance. Wu Jiandong and his guys shot, like actual guns, at the police. Hey, you're not allowed to do that in the 1980s. It's practically unthinkable. Well, these policemen, they didn't encounter this kind of resistance regularly, but they were well-trained police professionals. They know what to do. They shot back. So now, on the streets of Hong Kong, something very rare is playing out, an actual gun battle. And it goes on for 1 or 2 minutes with 20 or 30 shots being fired. Like, by the standards of Hong Kong, this is the battle of the century. Nothing like this has happened in Hong Kong since the Japanese busted in half a century before. But then, suddenly, the firefight just ends. It goes quiet because the police are out of ammo. They have each fired their 6-issue rounds. At this point in history, if you're a Hong Kong police officer, that's all you got. 6 rounds. I mean, what would you even need a 7th round for? What are these cops, like, shooting IDPA matches on their lunch hour? Do they think that Godzilla is going to come and invade Victoria Harbor? No, 6 rounds is probably 6 rounds more than any cop needs. So once they've emptied the cylinders on their very handsome Smith & Wesson revolvers, they're done. So Wu Jiandong and his 4 armed accomplices now can just walk away with their loot. They run And it's only by luck that they stumble across another pair of Hong Kong police patrolmen. And those two police officers also get the same treatment from Wu Jiandong and his guys, a hail of gunfire from a bunch of Type 54 pistols. So now the Hong Kong police have lost 3 men wounded, 1 dead, and they have done nothing to stop the getaway of the bad guys. And those bad guys now disappear without a trace. The Hong Kong police, who have a very good intelligence network, scour the city for their hiding place. But what they only come to realize gradually is they're not in Hong Kong anymore. They've gone back over the border into China, which they seem to be able to just cross back and forth at will. And now they are safe at home with a pile of Hong Kong dollars that make them quite rich by the standards of 1980s Guangdong. The thieves probably could have called it a day. They would have had a wonderful nest egg to start a good, honest life back home now. But that wasn't enough. A lot of high living meant that 3 years later, they needed a second heist. So Wu Jiandong smuggled himself back into Hong Kong, and he found a new and more lucrative target. This time, no mere jewelry store. He was going to hit an armored car operation, transferring money between bank branches. He found a bank in North Point, a nice residential area, where he could expect 5 guards armed with a single shotgun to be moving a great big case of cash from the bank into an armored car. So he knew that if he had 5 men accustomed to violence and with superior armament, he could just take that money from them probably without a fight. And that, in fact, is exactly what happened. On the day of the heist, in broad daylight, in a nice neighborhood, Wu Jiandong and 4 other guys show up with Type 56 pistols just as the 5 bank guards and their lone shotgun are coming out of the bank, expecting just another nice day in Hong Kong, when suddenly they're confronted by these desperados with pistols in their faces. And they're smart. They offer no resistance. Wu Jiandong and his guys strip the shotgun out of their hands, put the guards into the armored car and lock them in, and they take off in their getaway car with this big case of cash. After their getaway, they stop their car in a parking garage and attend to this great big haul of cash. With effort, they bust open this strong box. And it was like one of those moments in Pulp Fiction when they open the briefcase glowing with golden light, or like in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Inside this huge strong box are fat stacks totaling 140 million Japanese yen? What? Damn it! What in the world are they going to do with yen? They were expecting Hong Kong dollars, at most, maybe Chinese renminbi. Wu Jiandong had never stopped to think that he might actually end up stealing a currency that he couldn't spend anywhere, at least nowhere that he had access to. Friends, this is the 1980s. Money laundering hasn't been invented yet, at least not in the world of like low rent, illegal immigrant, Hong Kong smash and grab thugs. If you want to spend Japanese yen, you have to go to Japan. Otherwise, it's useless. Wu Jiandong and his Cantonese desperados, they can't do that. They're not going to be catching a British Airways flight from Kai Tak to nice, super clean Narita Airport, where the Japanese ground crew lines up and bows to the arriving and departing passenger jets. What are they going to like catch an airport shuttle down to the Ginza with their heisted cash box of stolen yen and then like deposit it at the Sumitomo Bank in a nice, sensible savings account? No! These guys don't even have passports. They're they're screwed. They might as well have stolen like a bank full of Confederate dollars. To them, these things are useless. So he is in a pickle. He just carried off a picture perfect bank heist of something that's incredibly valuable that would make him the richest scumbag in the province of Guangdong, except that it is completely useless to him in particular. And also, it weighs a ton. So he's holed up there with his banditos in this parking garage, trying to figure out what do we do when who rolls up and blocks the entrance to the parking garage but the Hong Kong police. Their rapid response squad has tailed them to their location. And I'm told that the Hong Kong police had actually formed this squad precisely in response to Wu's jewelry store heist 3 years before, when they learned that it wasn't enough to just like show up with a badge and a gun and expect people to start obeying you. So just in case something so awful should ever happen again, they formed this squad. And sure enough, now public enemy number one is back, and these guys are here for vengeance and vindication. They've tailed Wu, and now here they are in body armor, blocking his escape from the parking garage, and they're calling for the surrender of the criminals inside. So, what does Wu's gang do now? Do they give up? Ha! Are you kidding? No, they open fire. And importantly, they open fire with their Type 54 pistols, which means that even though the Hong Kong police are ready for them this time, or at least they think they're ready, they've arrived, prepared for a gunfight. It turns out they are still outgunned by these Type 54s. Even though they've arrived with 4 guys in body armor and achieved surprise, still they instantly get suppressed by Wu's 5 men with Type 54 pistols. Wu's guys are putting out a brisk fire, and those little 7.62 millimeter Tokarev fireballs are slicing through things that are supposed to be hard cover for the police. In fact, it's at this point, even though the story is far from over, but it's now that the Type 54's infamous ability to overpenetrate causes the worst tragedy of the whole escapade. As this high-volume gunfight is happening in the nice neighborhood of North Point in a very crowded city, a woman, a waitress, has gotten caught in the crossfire. And when the shooting started, she very intelligently ducked behind some kind of trash receptacle to take cover. However, one of the robber's Tokarev bullets hits this big object, passes through the front side, passes out the back side, and hits her in the head. So now the police are in an even worse position. They're not only outnumbered and outgunned, but now they also have a civilian casualty to attend to as a very high priority. And inside the parking garage, Wu Jiandong hears their fire slacken. He notices this and he decides to take advantage of this shift in momentum. Wu now grabs the shotgun that they stripped off the armored car guards. He charges the police line with this shotgun and empties the whole tube magazine at them, thoroughly suppressing them. And then he throws away the empty shotgun, and he and the other robbers flee and break out of the parking garage. Thankfully, the police officers who got shotgunned all survived with only minor injuries. They were wearing vests, and their vests protected them from the brunt of whatever load was in that shotgun. The worst injuries they got were some stray pellets that hit above the vests that didn't cause serious injuries. This is the amazing part. They were actually very lucky that they got hit with the shotgun load and not with the Tokarev bullets, because I think those might very well have penetrated the relatively primitive body armor of the 1980s. That's amazing. That's got to be one of the only times in the history of firearms when somebody could truthfully say, sure, I got hit point blank, but luckily it was only a shotgun. After that now, amazingly, Wu Jiandong and his guys are back on the loose. As of this moment, not only are they still on a completely unrestricted rampage in a wide open field with zero effective resistance from the Hong Kong police, who are nobody's pushover. But also, as of this moment, these five guys now have serious gunfighting experience that they've accrued. Wu alone has now been in four separate gunfights that have left 9 people dead or wounded, with zero consequences to himself. And we haven't even gotten to the grenades yet. The only thing wrong with Wu's life right now, other than its entire direction, is that he has had to leave behind the cash box. It was too big. The Japanese yen were not going to be useful to him. And right now, he's just lucky to be alive and free. Even at this, however, the plucky Royal Hong Kong Police Department has turned out in force. They've now swarmed North Point. They see Wu's guys running out of the parking garage, trying to blend in with pedestrians on the high street and slip away, which is not okay with them. Every time they lose contact with Wu, he shows up again and people get shot. So, a really gutsy police commander now makes an incredible call. He has his officers charge into the crowd, shooting warning shots in the air and yelling, "Everybody down!" Suddenly, then, the people drop, and the police figure whoever is left standing is probably a bad guy. So then they call out a challenge to them, and the bad guys, sure enough, reveal themselves by drawing their guns again and firing back at the police. Now, the police decide to shoot back. It's a really risky call because of all the innocent people who are cowering on the ground around the criminals, but I understand why they risked it, and their gamble kind of paid off. First, no civilians were hit in this exchange, so far as I know, and the police finally hit one of the criminals, a guy named Tan Zhipeng. So finally, the bad guys have lost one of their number. And in fact, this loss of Tan Zhipeng is going to become a very important turning point in their saga. They leave Tan behind to be captured by the police. And this is a clear violation of the Chinese underworld code, which is no man left behind. Reportedly, Wu's men want to shoot Tan and leave him so that he can tell no tales, but Wu can't do it. He's willing to leave Tan behind. That's already a breach of the code, but he's not going to kill this man that he's borne arms with. Maybe some vestige of thieves' honor still remains in him. And so they run off and they abandon Tan to the police because they have their escape planned already. They have a safe house, and they're going to wait in that house so that they can slip back across the border again. This plan has served them well one time before. They just need to get outside the jurisdiction of the frighteningly well-informed Hong Kong police, and then once they're back in the mainland, they can breathe easy. They won't have any ill-gotten gains to spend this time, but they're alive and free. And they can always try again because they have definitely found Hong Kong's weak spot. There's a lot of money and it's just not guarded very well. But it's at this moment that karma finally comes back to bite Wu Jiandong in the butt. The wounded comrade that he left behind, Tan Zhipeng, has given up the plan to the police. And the full might of the Royal Hong Kong Police Department now comes down on Wu and his gang in their lair in the form of their famous SWAT team, the Flying Tigers, the Fei Hu Dui. The Flying Tigers assault the safe house, and they are repelled. What? Yes, even now, they still don't come in heavy enough. They still are living in a bygone age when they're not truly prepared for a bunch of powerfully armed men who are willing to just fight and shoot people in the blink of an eye. So amazingly, even their SWAT team is repelled by Wu and his survivors from their safe house. The fusillade from inside is so intense, and I'm told that Wu's guys even have a bunch of grenades that they've stolen from the PLA, smuggled into Hong Kong with them, and they start throwing them. And once again, Wu Zhendong and his guys break out into an open field and they start running for it. And they find practically the whole Hong Kong police department is out there on the street now. Scores of them. And sure, maybe they just have dinky little 38 special revolvers. But Wu may be a stone cold killer, but he does have a sense of preservation. And he knows that with all the men and all the ruthlessness that he has, he's not going to survive this. Nobody thought it could be done, but Wu finally just puts down his gun, signals to his guys to do the same thing, and he surrenders. This is not what I expected. Wu sure had the reputation of a man who could not be brought in alive. But finally, he's brought to justice, and he's given a life sentence with no possibility of parole. And sure enough, he ended up dying in jail in Hong Kong. Unfortunately, though, he had done just enough to ignite the legend of the Black Star pistol, that there was now a group of mainland criminals looking to make it big in Hong Kong, armed with greater ruthlessness and a brace of Type 54s. If you've seen John Woo movies where like robbers pull out a pair of pistols and start using them both ambidextrously, if you're like me, you've looked at that and just thought, please, ridiculous. But friends, this is actually based on real life. It's based on the career of Wu Zhendong's even worse, more malevolent, and more dangerous successor and imitator, an actual PLA combat veteran named Chen Huji. Chen Huji was also a mainlander who had come into Hong Kong illegally for work as a very low-level enforcer for the Hong Kong mob. Unlike Wu Zhendong, he wasn't even Cantonese. Wu had connections, but at least he knew the lingo, and at least he knew how to posture. He had made a sort of a name for himself as a crazy guy from this dangerous, chaotic land known as mainland China, and you never knew what he might do, and if the other guy pulled a knife, he would pull a gun, and he was willing to use it. But Chen Huju didn't even have that. He was a minor criminal with no status in the underworld and a big chip on his shoulder. But one day, before Wu Zhendong was brought in by the law, Chen Huji met Wu Zhendong. And as one mainlander to another, Chen talked to Wu and he realized this guy's a fraud. All his big talk about his military training and stuff, Chen Huji, he was an insider to the PLA and he saw through Wu in a minute. He realized this guy was just like teenage hooligan who like maybe once touched a gun and had been in some fights. But Chen himself, he was a real combat soldier. He had been in Vietnam. He had seen real action. And he figured if Wu, this jumped up nobody poser, if he can wrap the Hong Kong police around his finger and use them like a yo-yo, he thought, let's see what the Hong Kong police do when a squad of real PLA soldiers show up and they mean business and they know how to rock and roll. Friends, if Wu Zhendong's fight was Hong Kong's version of the FBI gunfight in Miami, the kind of wake-up call for Hong Kong law enforcement when they realized, oh gosh, our 38 special revolvers are not going to cut it anymore, then Chen Huju's rampage was like the North Hollywood shootout in LA a few years later, when honest to goodness urban warfare broke out in Los Angeles, and all the King's soldiers and all the LAPD could barely put these guys back in the box. That was Chen Huju's so-called contribution to Hong Kong law enforcement. He smuggled himself into Hong Kong with 6 other PLA combat veterans. This is a Chinese 6. 6 other combat veterans and a bunch of AKs, which they ended up not using. Turned out on the streets of Hong Kong, even though they're crowded, AKs turned out to be a little bit suspicious. But they also brought enough Type 54 Black Star pistols that each of them had two of them, just like a John Woo flick. And he targeted a very high-end jewelry store that specialized in super expensive watches. Now, the Hong Kong Police Department may not have been well armed enough yet by this point, but they did have really good intelligence, and they actually knew that Chen Huju was coming. Chen had been smart in one way, in that he lined up his fence ahead of time, the man who was going to receive the goods that he stole from this watch store, and then convert them into quick cash for Chen so that they could make a getaway back across the border into China proper. Well, what he didn't know was that the fence had then gone and promptly informed the Hong Kong police. So the Hong Kong police now knew where Chen Huju was going to hit, and they thought they had an idea about when. Chen, though, may have had a tip-off that the police were expecting him. He did definitely detect their surveillance on the store. When he came back in from the mainland with his crew of guys, he did a final reconnaissance of the jewelry store. He could tell from something about the so-called street vendors who were police in disguise, posing as folks selling stuff on the sidewalks and the corners around the bank. And from the unusual presence of uniformed police patrols, he knew something was up. He knew that they were expecting him. But then he did another round and he looked at these guys and he thought, they look like they've been out here for a long time. He had deliberately taken a good month to slowly come into Hong Kong to enact his plan. And it seemed to him that the surveillance teams had been out there this whole time, just day after day, week after week, and that boredom and lassitude had set in among them. Chen judges that the cops sitting on the jewelry store are tired, bored, and unaware. And he makes one other calculation too. He looks at them, sizes them up, and he thinks they're soft, that they're not nearly as acquainted as he and his men are with the high adrenaline violence of a gunfight. They've done this before, the cops haven't. And he knows from personal experience that that's going to make a big difference in how effectively they can react to a team of guys with training and experience and are prepared to instantaneously loose gunfire and do it as a tactically cohesive group. So amazingly, Chen decides, even though they're ready for him, he's going to do it anyway. He's spent too much time setting this up. He doesn't think enough of their preparedness. He decides to go for it. And actually, the way things unfolded, he was not wrong to do it. He and his men walk in wearing, you can't make this up, trench coats with body armor underneath. And they each pull out a pair of Type 54 pistols and they yell, "This is a stick up, hit the floor." And everybody does it. Two of their guys are posted in masks outside the door of the jewelry store to keep curious onlookers away and warn of any oncoming policemen. This might have been a good idea in some other place and time, but these guys must not really have understood what Hong Kong is like on Nathan Road at 10:30 at night. In Hong Kong's Golden Mile, the streets are full of people at night, walking around outside, having a good time, shopping. And so these two masked gunmen standing outside, they attract attention. They are clearly not fitting in with the pedestrian flow of traffic. And it's like that Sesame Street song, "One of these things is not like the others." So also, it turns out that sometimes Hong Kong movie and TV studios would use this very area to film scenes for cop and robber movies. So the passersby did not run away from the gunmen. They actually crowded around in a semicircle. They're like looking around, trying to figure out where the TV cameras are. And probably people are like looking into the interior of the store, going like, "Hey, look, they're doing a scene inside too." So now the gunman standing outside the door, whose job was to keep curious people away to begin with, start like coarsely cursing the people who are gathering on the sidewalk. But but the more they do that, the more people are interested and the more folks throng around. They must have been like, "Hey, cool. This is like one of those dinner theaters where the performers interact with you." And other people must be like looking around going, "Oh my gosh, am I on TV right now? Am I going to be an extra in the background of a Jackie Chan movie?" So finally, one person walks up to this ludicrous scene who actually sees it for what it is. It's a police patrolman. And he recognized what's going on. And he walks right up, draws, and shoots one of the masked men right in the chest. I suppose the rules of engagement for the Royal Hong Kong Police allowed a certain latitude. So he shoots this guy in the chest, and the guy falls back onto the ground. And so the cop is walking up, figuring he's going to kick the gun away from the fallen man, when the fallen man sits up like a horror movie and shoots the cop in the chest. Inside the store, things have gone even more pear-shaped. The robbers inside brought a hammer with them, expecting to do a garden variety smash and grab. What they didn't know was that when Hong Kong police intelligence got word through the grapevine that there was a job that might go down at this jewelry store, they did install bulletproof glass in their display cases. So now the robbers come in. They've gotten the compliance of all the staff and customers in the store who've obediently dropped to the floor, and they pull out their hammer and bong, nothing happens. More they whack it, the more frustrated they get. Nothing is happening. And now Chen Huju takes his Type 54 and points it at the display case. Like, "Hey, there's a great idea. Take a pistol cartridge that's infamous for killer ricochet magic bullets and shoot it at the bulletproof glass in an enclosed space." Just then, thankfully for everyone involved, they hear the shooting beginning outside. They look outside, and the lookouts out on the street have now jumped into the decorative sidewalk shrubbery that adorns the nice streets in Hong Kong. And they're using that as cover to calmly shoot at the growing swarm of police officers who are responding to this robbery call. The police clearly are doing this for the first time. The robbers, however, are not, and they are stacking bodies out there. The police loosed something like twice the number of shots at the robbers. They didn't hit anything, but the robbers are dropping officers right and left. Inside the store now, one of the employees, a young woman, pulls out her key ring helpfully and says, "Hey, instead of shooting the glass, let me open the case for you." She does that, and for her trouble, she gets taken hostage. The robbers hastily stuff their pockets full of as much loot as they dare, and they start making their way out, with her held in front of them. When they get out onto the sidewalk, something happens that surprises them completely. The police, seeing the hostage, stop shooting at them. Reportedly, Chen Huju, the cold-blooded gunman, was so surprised that the police would actually pass up a chance to plug him just because an innocent life was present that he starts laughing out loud at them, at their helplessness. Well, the police are in a real pickle now. They are afraid to shoot at the bad guys for fear of hitting their hostage. They can't get near the bad guys. They're being held away very effectively. And these robbers are showing that as far as close combat goes, this is not their first rodeo. They are moving and shooting and communicating like professionals, totally outclassing the inexperienced police, at least inexperienced in this kind of mayhem. The police are completely outgunned now. Their 38 specials are great. I mean, I love a 38 special. They're awesome. But it turns out they are not awesome for assaulting a squad-sized element of PLA infantry who have tactical momentum on their side, and they're shooting these supersonic pocket bazookas that literally shoot through bricks. The police's second problem is that
the desperados
are getting away. With their hostage, this total of 8 people is now moving systematically under fire from the front of the jewelry store to a truck that they've staged there in advance as a getaway vehicle. They're maneuvering toward there, and the police realize they have neglected to make any preparations to block off the street. Now, this is amazing because they have a great number of officers, reportedly scores of officers, poised to respond to this incident, which they were expecting. They didn't know quite when, but they have this target under surveillance, and they felt certain that they would see this incident forming and be in the door, holding the malefactors at gunpoint long before a single shot could be loosed. The robbers were not supposed to be able to gain fire superiority over the officers and then start maneuvering toward a getaway vehicle and streak out into the streets of Hong Kong. So the police think fast, and their plan is pretty good. Their next move is that they send in this improvised armored assault. See, they have a squad car that's been up-armored to some degree, and they pack 4 officers with guns into that thing, and they start driving it at the bandits. The idea is that this is going to be an armored sniper platform, and they're going to be able to roll it toward the bad guys. And despite the presence of the hostage, they're hoping to be able to have enough safety inside this vehicle that they can kind of pick their shots and shoot at least whatever target isn't being covered by the hostage and seems safe and opportune. However, to their amazement, the Type 54 Tokarev cartridges just slice through their lame so-called armor plating in the patrol car, and it quickly incapacitates all 4 officers in the vehicle. So there goes that plan. It's only now, after the police's situation has been turned upside down and things look completely hopeless, that they get one of those lucky breaks, like in the case of Wen Dong, where the robbers take a casualty, and that steals the momentum from them. What happened in this case was that as the robbers were getting into a van, a pair of officers appeared near the vehicle, and one of them, a Brit, sticks his gun into the window and starts shooting. Now, one of his bullets hits the hostage. Happily, she lived. His other bullet, however, drills one of the robbers through the head, and still another bullet flies right past the dome of Tanu, the bandit-in-chief. So far, he has been the master of this situation. So he now, amazingly, gets out of the getaway vehicle and rounds on this police officer who has been hit by a bunch of return fire. One bullet has wounded his leg, and he's dropped to his knees. And Chen Huji, furious, walks up to this officer who's now down and disarmed, points his pistol right at the officer's forehead, and he pulls the trigger. Now, I've heard 2 different accounts of exactly what happened then. The first, and I think perhaps more credible account, is that the hammer drops on what was either a hard primer or it was a light strike, and the cartridge fails to detonate. Well, Chun has practiced this kind of thing before. He does the usual failure drill: tap, rack, and no bang. The gun is empty. It has locked open on an empty magazine. Now, there is a version of the story that says that he goes back to the truck, and he doesn't get in. He reaches inside, and he says to one of his men, "Give me that thing," takes the gun out of his hand, and comes back to repeat this villainous execution shot on the police officer. And in this version, again, the gun turns out to be empty. Now, whichever account is true, this officer has used 2 of his 9 lives, and he is probably surrounded by bulletproof angels. With that, Chen finally decides that things are getting too hot. He decides to call it a day, gets in the truck, and I'm sorry to say, they make a clean getaway. Just vroom. Just like Wen Dong, even though they're part of this enormous fusillade that sets records for the Hong Kong police blotter. They've gotten away. Sure, they have a casualty with a head wound in the van. They had a hostage who's been wounded. They leave her behind. They don't want to be burdened with her now. And happily, she recovers from her wound. And then, whoosh, off they go into the night to their safe house, just like Wen Dong. The Hong Kong police have incredible egg on their faces. And as you can imagine, the disgrace of this incident reverberates far into the future of the Hong Kong Police Department. Investigations are made and things are changed. But that doesn't change the fact that for right now, the Hong Kong police have a gang of murderous gunmen on the loose. And this time round, they know that they got to find them fast, or they're probably going to slip across the border to China and perhaps escape justice forever. Well, friends, I'm happy to report that their story ends much the way the Wu Jiandong gang's story ended, but this time cleaner. The Hong Kong police take advantage of their experience and their acknowledged excellence at criminal underworld intelligence. And in no time at all, they end up planting 3 informants on Chen Huju's gang to replace his 3 casualties. And these informants succeed in sending the police, this is like a movie, sending a coded message to police in the form of a note that's sent with a little child who walks up to the police and says, "Some men told me to give this to you." And it gives them the whereabouts of Chen Huju's lair. And they send in the heat on these guys, and they find them having just set fire to their lair. There, they've abandoned the body of their fallen casualty who have succumbed to that head wound. And their plan is to burn down the lair, get rid of his body and all evidence that way, and use the commotion to move onward and effect their exfil plan to get back to the mainland. Just as they've set this fire, that's when the SWAT team comes. And this time, they're ready. The SWAT team comes in so fast, so hard, that no bullets can fly this time. Nobody can lob surplus grenades that they've infiltrated from the mainland. And the whole gang is taken into custody without a shot fired. Now, the story ends in kind of a strange way. Chen Huju ended up, of course, being imprisoned, but only for 13 years. That's really extraordinary for the biggest, most violent armed robbery that Hong Kong has seen, at least in modern memory. And I think there's still some controversy about how he got off with such a light sentence, especially when Wu Jiandong got a life sentence. The best account that I've heard is that Chen got quote unquote lucky in the sense that nobody died. In the 120 some shots that were exchanged between the robbers and the police, many people were hit, but the police officers and the hostages all made recoveries. And I'm told that under Hong Kong law, this meant that the charges against Chen and his men could only be so severe, and they wouldn't warrant life imprisonment like Wu Jiandong. So Chen eventually got out. You might also say that Chen was a quote unquote success in one other perverse way. He set an example for other criminals to follow. There followed about 10 years of tough guys, many of them from the mainland, who felt like they had found the weakness of the Hong Kong police. They felt that they too might have the right stuff, the kind of penchant for violence that they could put to use in Hong Kong effectively, and maybe gain a lot of hard currency. So that set off a decade of banditry in Hong Kong. And next time you watch something like a John Woo movie, one of these high volume cinematic bullet storms that came out of the Hong Kong cinema in the 80s and 90s, you're not watching complete fantasy that just popped out of the head of some screenwriter. You're watching something that actually was kind of torn from the headlines, inspired by real life. And before you say about some particular detail, like the dual-wielding trenchcoat bandits. Like, oh, that could never happen. That's ridiculous. Look into it. It might just really be based in fact. Friends, this has been Type 56, the story of China's army. We don't normally do cops and robbers thrillers, but in this case, since it was all propelled by the Chinese army's signature handgun, we kind of had to do it. I'm Jason Clower. I look forward to seeing you next time. If you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. Please do us a favor and share. Maybe you'll visit our Patreon page. But in any case, this channel is free to all the world's workers, soldiers, and peasants. I'll see you next time.